Imagine thousands of islands spread out like a necklace along the equator. That's the Indonesian archipelago, and its history is as exciting and colorful as its geography. Long, long ago, before anyone wrote things down, these islands were home to ancient kingdoms full of mystery and legends. Powerful empires like Srivijaya on the island of Sumatra around the 7th century became important because of sea trade. They controlled the important sea routes connecting the east and the west, trading spices, gold, and religious ideas. These early kingdoms built amazing things like the beautiful Borobudur temple in central Java. Built by the Buddhist Sailendra dynasty around the 9th century, Borobudur shows how skilled these ancient Indonesians were in architecture and art. Its detailed carvings and tall towers give us a peek into their spiritual beliefs and culture. But these kingdoms weren't all the same. Because the islands were so spread out, different cultures and languages developed. Some kingdoms followed Hinduism and Buddhism, while others kept their own traditional beliefs. This mix of cultures and traditions would shape Indonesia's history for centuries to come. When Hinduism and Buddhism arrived from India around the early AD years, it was a big change for Indonesia. These religions didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were brought by traders and scholars who traveled across the seas, carrying not only goods but also ideas and beliefs. The local rulers and their courts were quick to adopt these new religions, seeing them as a way to enhance their own power and prestige. This adoption wasn't a simple process. It involved a complex interplay of acceptance, adaptation, and integration with existing local traditions and beliefs. Traders and scholars brought these religions, and local rulers and their courts started to follow them. The influence of Hinduism and Buddhism can be seen in the art, architecture, and cultural practices of the time. Temples were built, adorned with intricate carvings that depicted stories from Hindu and Buddhist texts. These structures were not just places of worship, but also centers of learning and culture where scholars would gather to discuss philosophy, science, and the arts. They mixed these new beliefs with their own traditions, creating something unique. This blending of cultures led to a rich tapestry of religious and cultural practices that were distinctly Indonesian. Festivals and ceremonies often featured a mix of Hindu, Buddhist, and local elements, creating a vibrant and diverse cultural landscape. This syncretism is evident in the art and literature of the period, which often combine motifs and themes from different traditions. The Majapahit Empire, starting in the late 13th century, shows this mix perfectly. The empire was a melting pot of different cultures and religions, and this diversity was one of its greatest strengths. The rulers of Majapahit were adept at managing this diversity, using it to their advantage to create a stable and prosperous empire. The capital city of Trowulan was a bustling metropolis with grand palaces, temples, and markets that attracted people from all over the region. Based in East Java, Majapahit controlled a lot of the islands and even parts of mainland Southeast Asia. The empire's influence extended far beyond its borders, thanks to its powerful navy and strategic location along important trade routes. Majapahit was a major player in the regional trade networks, and its ports were hubs of commerce and cultural exchange. Goods, ideas, and people flowed in and out of the empire, enriching its culture and economy. Ruled by the famous King Hayam Wuruk and his smart Prime Minister Gajah Mada, Majapahit had a golden age of power, wealth, and culture. King Hayam Wuruk was a visionary leader who expanded the empire's territory and influence, while Gajah Mada was a brilliant strategist and administrator who helped to consolidate and govern the vast empire. Together, they oversaw a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural flourishing. We know about Majapahit from the epic poem Nagara Kretagama, which tells us how big the empire was and how fancy the court was. This poem, written by the court poet Mpu Prapanka, provides a detailed account of the empire's geography, administration, and culture. It describes the grandeur of the royal court with its elaborate ceremonies, luxurious palaces, and sophisticated bureaucracy. The Nagara Kretagama is a valuable historical source that gives us a glimpse into the life and times of Majapahit. The poem describes how the government worked, their special ceremonies, and the many different people they ruled. Majapahit was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire, and its rulers were skilled at managing this diversity. The government was highly organized, with a complex system of administration that ensured efficient governance. Ceremonies and rituals played a crucial role in maintaining social order and reinforcing the authority of the rulers. It also shows how important trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange were for Majapahit's power. The empire's strategic location made it a key player in the regional trade networks, and its rulers were adept at forging alliances and maintaining diplomatic relations with neighboring states. Cultural exchange was also a significant aspect of Majapahit's power, as it helped to spread the empire's influence and integrate diverse communities within its borders. But Majapahit's success also led to its downfall. The very diversity that was its strength also became a source of internal conflict. As the empire grew, it became increasingly difficult to manage its vast and diverse territories. Local rulers and factions began to vie for power, leading to internal strife and weakening the central authority. Fighting within the empire, arguments over who would be the next ruler and new powerful neighbors weakened Majapahit. Succession disputes were particularly damaging as rival claimants to the throne engaged in bitter power struggles. At the same time, neighboring states and emerging powers began to challenge Majapahit's dominance, further eroding its strength. By the late 15th century, Majapahit had fallen apart, making way for a new era in Indonesian history, the arrival of Europeans and the rise of Islam. The decline of Majapahit marked the end of an era, but it also set the stage for new developments. The arrival of European traders and colonizers brought new challenges and opportunities, while the spread of Islam introduced new cultural and religious dynamics that would shape the future of Indonesia. So, at the start of the 16th century, things changed a lot. The world was on the brink of a new era marked by exploration and the quest for wealth. European nations, driven by the desire for spices and other exotic goods, began to look beyond their borders, setting their sights on the rich and mysterious lands of Southeast Asia. When European explorers came to Southeast Asia, they were amazed by the wealth of resources and the vibrant cultures they encountered. The region was a hub of trade, with merchants from all over Asia exchanging goods and ideas. They wanted spices like cloves, nutmeg, and mace, which grew in the Maluku Islands. These spices were incredibly valuable in Europe, not just for their flavor, but also for their use in preserving food and making medicines. Portuguese sailors were the first to arrive. They were skilled navigators and had already established a presence in India and Africa. Their arrival in Southeast Asia marked the beginning of a new chapter in the region's history. They took over Malacca in 1511, a very important trading port connecting the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. This strategic location allowed them to control the flow of goods between the East and the West, giving them a significant advantage in the spice trade. But other European countries, like Spain, the Netherlands, and England, also wanted the spice trade. They saw the immense profits that could be made and were eager to get a piece of the action. They all wanted to control it. This led to intense competition and conflict as each nation tried to outmaneuver the others and establish their dominance in the region. The Dutch, with their East India Company, were the most successful but also the most ruthless. They were determined to monopolize the spice trade and were willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. They took over important trading posts, often using violence to get rid of rivals and control local rulers. Their aggressive tactics allowed them to dominate the spice trade and amass great wealth. The arrival of Europeans changed Indonesia a lot. The traditional ways of life were disrupted and the local economies were transformed to serve the interests of the European powers. At first they just wanted to trade, but then they wanted to control everything. The Europeans began to impose their own systems of governance and exploit the region's resources for their own benefit. They interfered with local rulers and used rivalries to their advantage. By playing different factions against each other, they were able to maintain control and keep the local populations divided. The spice trade, once good for local rulers, became a way for Europeans to get rich, making many parts of Indonesia poor. The wealth generated by the spice trade flowed out of the region, leaving the local people to deal with the consequences. This time also saw Islam spreading. As the European powers fought for control, Islam continued to grow and spread throughout the archipelago. It had been growing in Indonesia since the 13th century. The religion had taken root in many communities, particularly in coastal areas where trade was most active. As Europeans fought for control, Islam united many Indonesians, especially in coastal trading towns. The shared faith provided a sense of identity and solidarity in the face of foreign domination. By the 17th century, Islam was the main religion in most of the archipelago, shaping Indonesia's culture and religion even more. The influence of Islam can still be seen today in the country's traditions, art, and daily life. Section 4. The Dutch East Indies, Colonialism and its Impacts. The Dutch East India Company, or VOC, started in 1602 and changed Indonesia forever. This powerful trading company was not just a business, it was a force that shaped the destiny of an entire region. The VOC was granted extensive powers by the Dutch government, including the ability to wage war, imprison and execute convicts, negotiate treaties, strike its own coins, and establish colonies. First, it was all about trade, but the VOC slowly took over more and more, using local problems and fighting wars to control local rulers. They were strategic and ruthless, exploiting local conflicts and rivalries to their advantage. The VOC's influence grew as they established a monopoly over the spice trade, which was highly lucrative at the time. By the 1700s, the VOC controlled most of the islands, creating a huge colony called the Dutch East Indies. This vast territory included many of the islands that make up modern-day Indonesia. The VOC's control was not just economic but also political and social, as they imposed their own systems of governance and law. The VOC was very harsh. They ruled with an iron fist, often resorting to brutal methods to maintain control and suppress any resistance. The local population was subjected to severe punishments for any form of dissent or rebellion. They forced people to work and grow crops like coffee, sugar, and other valuable commodities. The local population was coerced into labor, often under inhumane conditions. The VOC's primary goal was to maximize profits, and they did so at the expense of the local people and indigo to send to Europe. These crops were highly sought after in European markets, and the VOC capitalized on this demand. The forced cultivation of these crops led to widespread suffering among the local population, who were often left with little to sustain themselves. This system, called the cultivation system, made the Dutch rich but made Indonesians poor and hungry. The cultivation system required local farmers to dedicate a portion of their land and labor to growing export crops, which left them with insufficient resources to grow food for their own families. The VOC went broke in 1799, so the Dutch government took over. The transition from company rule to direct colonial administration did not significantly improve the lives of the local population. The Dutch government continued many of the exploitative practices established by the VOC. They slowly stopped the cultivation system, but they still exploited the people. The Dutch introduced new policies and systems of labor that continued to benefit the colonial rulers at the expense of the local population. The exploitation of natural and human resources remained a central feature of Dutch colonial rule. They said they wanted to help Indonesians with ethical policies, but they really just wanted to keep making money and stop Indonesians from wanting independence. These so-called ethical policies included efforts to improve education, healthcare, and infrastructure, but they were often half-hearted and primarily aimed at maintaining control over the population. Dutch rule had a big lasting effect on Indonesia. The legacy of colonialism can still be seen today in the economic, social, and political structures of the country. The exploitation and oppression experienced during this period left deep scars on the Indonesian people. It created a plantation economy, used up natural resources, and led to significant environmental degradation. The focus on cash crops for export resulted in deforestation and the depletion of soil fertility, which had long-term consequences for the local environment and agriculture, and made a strict social system with Europeans on top. The colonial social hierarchy placed Europeans at the top, followed by a small group of local elites who collaborated with the colonizers, and the vast majority of Indonesians at the bottom, subjected to discrimination and exploitation. It also started the idea of Indonesian nationalism, as more and more people wanted freedom from Dutch rule. The harsh realities of colonial rule sparked a growing sense of national identity and a desire for independence, leading to the rise of nationalist movements in the early 20th century. These movements laid the groundwork for Indonesia's eventual struggle for independence, which was achieved in 1945. Section 5. Seeds of Nationalism, Early 20th Century Awakenings. Around 1900, Indonesian nationalism started to grow. The Dutch, even though they said they were helping, actually made Indonesians feel like they were all in the same boat and that they didn't want to be ruled by foreigners. Education, even though it was limited, introduced Indonesians to new ideas about independence and nationhood. Early nationalist groups started, first wanting more control within the Dutch East Indies. Budi Utomo started in 1908, focused on education and culture, hoping to help Indonesians by improving themselves. Sarekat Islam started in 1911, mixed religion and politics, wanting economic fairness and Indonesian businesses. These early groups, although different, had the same goal: to make life better for Indonesians and have more control over their future. They challenged the Dutch idea that they were helping and said Indonesians should decide their own future. But independence was a long way off. The Dutch government made some changes, but they didn't want to give up power. The nationalist movement itself had different ideas about Indonesia's future. Even with these problems, the idea of Indonesian nationalism had started, and the desire for independence grew stronger.